Good morning and good afternoon and good day to everyone. We are here again for our weekly Haftorah Shiur with Dr. Jon Kelsen. So without further ado, please, Dr. Kelsen.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon. Welcome back to our weekly installation of the Haftorah Shiur. This week is Parashah Vayetze. And we'll jump in momentarily. Just two notes. One, or maybe I'll say three. One, and echoing Noah before, everyone is most invited and welcome. I'd actually prefer it if people would, jump in with your thoughts and questions and your own readings as we go. I missed the good old days when we were in one physical room and sharing more organically. And I know people are muted as they're listening because of the sort of Zoom functionality, idiosyncrasies, but would love to be able to, have a conversation here in a Beit Midrash, as it were. That's number one. Number two, just so you know, we are thinking seriously. We actually sort of have penciled in to continue the Haftorah Shiur into the next term, next Zman, which begin late January. I guess be interested, at some other point if you could shoot me a message or let me know if you would be interested in attending. And also, I would love if people have been enjoying and want to enlarge our crowd. The more voices, the richer the learning. So, if you've been in benefiting or enjoying, and you might recommend bring along a couple of friends for next week or for next term, that would be terrific. The third note is, just so you know, and I think advertising will start hitting the world soon, but we're planning our Winter Zman seminar this year, which will be the week of December 26th. You'll get all the details if you're on our listservs or following us on social media shortly, but just a little plug. We are focusing this year on kavanah, the notion of kavanah, which could be translated in different ways: intentionality, presence, focus, direction, and the primary questions we'll deal with are: what is kavanah, and how does one achieve or cultivate kavanah? So the way we're going to do that is a morning seder with my wonderful colleague, Dr. Shana Schick, who will be teaching a morning Talmud seminar for 4 mornings, the week of December 26th, on one specific sugya, one specific Talmudic passage dealing with kavanah b'mitzvot, the role of kavanah, let's call it for now intentionality, with regards to the fulfillment of the mitzvot, of the commandments, out of one particular passage in the Talmud and Masechet Rosh Hashanah. Kavanah is a very broad topic, and kavanah b'mitzvot is even itself is a broad topic. And this will focus on one. We're going to focus week on one particular sugya with many ramifications. So that'll be in the morning, and then the afternoons we are putting together, I think, a really, to me, very exciting roster of not just speakers, but experts, and to an extent practitioners of various techniques, strategies, practices designed to cultivate kavanah here even more narrowly than kavanah b'mitzvot, kavanah b'tfilah, kavanah in prayer, which is in one sense a kind of a paradigmatic mitzvah with regards to these issues. And it's also, on the other hand, an exceptional sui generis mitzvah. I say exceptional sui generis because while one could speak of shaking a lulav or giving charity for that matter, or honoring one's parents, or eating matzah, or et cetera, you could speak of all of those as sort of a physical action that one might do, and might have mitzvah value, even imagining it being absent of any kavanah. You could make that argument, at least. That's a big debate. When it comes to prayer, it gets harder to make that claim, right? It gets harder to make the claim that a prayer could still be a prayer, even if one has no intention behind or focus or presence behind one is doing, because it's, it is what we call avodah, what Chazal call avodah shebalev, worship of the heart. So if the heart or the mind, the lev, is not present, it gets harder to call that even a prayer to begin with, a prayer act to begin with. It's at most it's a speech act, right? There's nothing physical or tangible about it. So in any event, the afternoons will focus on kavanah b'tefillah and practices including use of the imagination, the imaginative faculty, visualization in cultivating kavanah, song and nigunim in cultivating kavanah, and some others as well. The text itself actually have a liturgy invites kavanah. So these were opportunities to not only learn about, but also from a distance, but to touch firsthand, even through a screen, to touch firsthand some of these practices. And perhaps, my hope is that someone might not only find things interesting, but also even motivating to try on some practices in one's own practice. So that is what we're looking towards. You'll see all this information in social media, etc. And stay tuned. But I really hope to see you all there and hope to see your friends there, if I might. Kathy, thank you for your note in the chat. We would love to see you in all of our learning going forward, including the Haftorah next month. Rumel, good morning to you. Just letting you know the note that the morning that we said in the beginning that we're hoping to continue this Haftorah, this sort of pilot, extend this pilot Haftorah Shiur course into next term. Which would begin, what we call our spring zman, even though it's the end of January, it begins, but it goes into the spring. And we'd love to see you. And if you've been enjoying, love to see, we ask you to think about others who could benefit as well, so we could have more voices here in learning. Okay, without further ado, everybody, this week is Parashat Vayetze, as we said. Now, in Parashat Vayetze, there's actually multiple traditions as to which Haftorah one reads, or which communities read. In Sephardic communities, and actually in the land of Israel, many communities read a Haftorah for Vayetze from Hosea 11, which is actually the Ashkenazi Haftorah for next week for Vayishlach. And then Sephardim for Vayishlach read from the prophet Ovadia, which is actually a very short book. Easily for those of you who are tuning in, partly because they want to learn more Tanakh, that's like another low-hanging fruit, like Malachi of last week. Ashkenazim also read from Hosea, but they read Hosea, both this week and next week. And that's what we're going to focus on here, at least for today, which is from the book of Hosea. And it'll become very clear pretty quickly why, at least for Lichor, like on prima facie, why these passages from Hosea were chosen to be paired with and in dialogue with the Parshiot of Vayishlach and Vayetze, whose primary protagonist is, we might say, Jacob, the Jacob narratives, the Yaakov stories. So with that, let me just make a note about just a little bit about the book of Hosea, not too much, but a little bit, and then we'll jump into the text proper. As always, I'll share screen with the text as we're going, but if you have a Tanakh at home or a book of Haftorah or Chumash, whatever, that's always great. So Hosea is the first, is at least ordered as the first of the so-called 12 minor prophets, the Trei Asar, the 12 minor prophets. Last week, Malachi, who we encountered, is the last of them. Hosea is the first of them. Hosea, according to the superscription at the beginning of the book, the sort of as the intro, it is said that Hosea prophesies during the reign of Yeravam the second, Yeravam not Ben Nevat, but the second Yeravam up in north, the king of Israel. These are the northern kingdom, and kings Uzziah and Yotam and Achaz and Chizkiyahu of Yehuda, of Judah. Some theorize that he theorize that he is a northern prophet for a variety of reasons. But be that as it may, there are 14 chapters in Hosea, and we are going to be dealing primarily with the latter chapters in the context of today's shiur, because that's where the Haftorah is drawn from. But perhaps we'll make reference to and mention of the beginning of the book as well. I say that because there are some repeating themes and motifs in the book of Hosea, which find expression both at the end, today's passages, and at the beginning. So to that extent, we may bring them together. Now, one thing that's interesting about Hosea, you'll find this sometimes with some of the prophets, but it's not, I wouldn't say it's super common to my knowledge, is that Hosea explicitly references, not just only through allusions, explicitly references some of the earlier traditions and protagonists. So, for example, he'll explicitly mention Jacob, Yaakov, and actually retell or paraphrase or draw from parts of the Jacob narrative. Malachi did this as well in a way. He mentioned Yaakov and Esav, but it doesn't get too much explicitly into the plot of Yaakov and Esav. We see sometimes Isaiah talking about Abraham or Kimei Noach, Zotli, etc. But it's just interesting. You see this in Psalms sometimes also. It's interesting how Hosea, we'll see in a moment, will sort of be, it's almost as if he's looking at Sefer Bereshit and riffing off of it in his prophecies. So let's just jump right in, therefore, and I'll share screen and we'll start our learning together. 1 second. You should all see now in front of you, right? Everyone good? Show of thumbs if you're good. Okay, excellent. Okay, so we are in Hosea chapter 12. The Haftorah cover, it goes from Hosea for this week, for Ashkenazim at least, goes from Hosea chapter 12, verse 13, okay, which is all the way down here. Vayivrach Yaakov Sedei Aram. And goes all the way to the end of the book, to the end of end of chapter 14. The Sephardim start a bit earlier. So let's first just jump right in where the Ashkenazim start, and then I'll sort of scroll up and show you, why one might start earlier, and we'll start learning together. Remember, we're in Parashah Vayetze, right? So Jacob, this is after Toldot and after the story of the selling of the birthright, and Jacob has been either made to flee from his brother or sent to find a wife. I'll come back to that. From Eretz Yisrael, Eretz Canaan, from his homeland, and he is sent forth. Vayetze Yaakov. He goes forth from Beersheba, and he goes to Haran. He was sent to Padan Aram, but he goes to Haran, which we remember, which is assumedly right within Padan Aram, and we know of as also associated with the beginning of the Abraham stories. And he gets to Haran, and there, after he has his vision of Beit El, he eventually gets to Lavan's house. He meets Rachel. He works for her, right? He gets Leah. He works again. He gets Rachel. They have children. Eventually leaves, returns to the land, this time with many more children and much wealth. Okay, so let's jump right in. Vayivrach Yaakov Sedei Aram. I'm in verse 13. Vayivrach Yaakov Sedei Aram. Vayavod Yisrael Be'isha. Uve'isha Shamar. Uve'navi He'alah Hashem Adonai et Yisrael miMitzrayim. Uve'navi Shamar. These are already very rich verses to pause and focus on. The prophet says, Hosea, that Jacob fled to the field of Aram. Sedei Aram might be sort of a Hebrew translation of the word Padan, if Padan also means something like plains or fields. So Padan Aram. Jacob fled to Sedei Aram, and Israel, assumedly being Jacob here, of course, worked for Vayavod Yisrael Be'isha. Right here they translate Be as for a wife, right? Uve'isha Shamar, and for a wife he had to guard. And then you see in the translation here, had to guard what? Had to guard sheep potentially, right? As a shepherd, or maybe Uve'isha Shamar, or perhaps he was guarding as well as keeping shmirah over and keeping guarding over his wife as well, right? Holding that relationship and that promise of a wife, close to the chest as he worked all those years. Uvenavi Hashem Yisrael, And we see here some sort of parallelism. You can see the language is very similar. Uvinavi ha'ala Hashem et Yisrael, and or but through a prophet, maybe this is Moshe, God took Israel out of Egypt. Uvinavi nishmar. Here they translate as, and through a prophet, they were guarded. So before we get to like sort of the meaning of this, the import of this in the prophecy in Hosea and the Haftorah, let's just sort of parse out what's happening here. We see here a parallelism between the story of Jacob, it's a parallelism and also a contrast, but the story of Jacob going to Padan Aram, to Sede Aram, and his experience there, and the experience of the Jewish people of Israel in Egypt, and God's bringing them out of Egypt, binavi, ubinavi nishmar. Looks like verse 13 ends, ubi isha shamar. Verse 14 ends, ubinavi nishmar. Let me pause there for one moment before we sort of like get into the weeds here of these verses. Think for a moment, and then please, unmute or write into the chat. What do you make of this comparison, this analogy? Maybe there's some contrast here as well between verses 13 and 14, meaning the experience of Jacob in Sede Aram and the experience of Israel in Egypt, both going in and coming out. What do you make of that? It's a large question, I suppose. In what ways are they similar, different? To what effect? Like, why is the prophet putting them into conversation, putting them into juxtaposing the two? Yeah.
One thing that strikes me is that part of the contrast, pardon me, between the Pesukim is that in 13, Yaakov is fleeing. And in a certain way, the people fled Egypt, but were actually being led or shepherded out. So they had a guide.
Mm-hmm.
They had Moshe, they had Hashem, and Yaakov is kind of on his own and doing this on his own. And he's not doing it because of any kind of call that has come. So that's something that jumps out at me.
Terrific. Thank you. Let's circle back to that before we pause to see if we can get some other voices here. But one thing I want to note is that, maybe you were alluding to this yourself, Beth. Jacob, it's true. When Jacob returns leaves Padan Aram to make his way back to Eretz Canaan, or to what will be the land, right? The land of Israel, eventually named after himself and his progeny. So Rivka, his mother, originally at the end of Parashah Toldot said, go there because your brother has it in for you. Go there until he forgets what you did to him, and calms down. And then ushalachti v'lakachticha misham, and then I will call for you and I will take you from there. Right? I will take you from there. The thing is, though, that never happens, at least not literally. Right? We never hear of Rivka sending a messenger to him to come back. So he does, in a sense. So he instead actually, instead of being sort of called to come back, he ends up fleeing from. And if you allow me just to say just another couple words about that, the verse here says here in Hosea that Jacob fled to Sede Aram. And when Rivka, at the end of in chapter 27, Bereshit, of Genesis, what I was just reading from, it says to him, you better get out of here because your brother has it in for you. So he wants to kill you. So she says to him, Kum. This is verse 43 of chapter 27. She says to him, Kum brach lecha el lavan achi. Brach lecha, flee for yourself. Flee for your own good. Sounds a lot like lech lecha, except it's not lech lecha, it's brach lecha, flee for yourself. Lech, I would argue, has a connotation, denotation of go towards. Lech, go somewhere. El. But brach lecha sounds clearly that you're fleeing from something. Now that's what she told him to do. Then she goes, what happens, if you recall, the end of last week, is that's what she tells Jacob. Then she tells Isaac. It's unclear what he knows and doesn't know about anything going on here. Could be he knows a heck of a lot. Could be he really is blind, as the text says. Blind, both literally and figuratively. So she says to him, "Oh, you know what? I'm really getting sick of these benot chet, who assumingly Esav has married. I really don't want Jacob to marry one of these women." So then Isaac calls Jacob and says to him, "Don't marry one of these women from these Canaanite women." Into chapter 28 of Bereshit. What does he tell him? Anyone remember? Chapter 28, verse 2. Genesis. Kum lech padena aram. Get up and go. Lech. Go. Lech lecha. Go there. Don't flee from, go there. And indeed, when Isaac in the beginning of Parashah Yitzei, departs from Beersheba and goes to Haran, it says he left Beersheba Yitzei, vayelech Harana. He goes. So it sounds like it's emphasizing the going towards rather than the fleeing from, at least in that part of the story. And in general, I think you could read maybe sort of two tones into the story of Jacob. One in which he is going towards, and that's sort of one type of posture, right? A blessed guy going off towards his future, gathering his wife and children and riches and heading home. Or you have the tone of sort of a more stressed tone of Brach, the guy who's fled from his homeland into exile, and there undergoes straits and miraculously makes his way back with with multiple wives and many children and riches and such. So Vayivrach Yaakov Sedei Edom. That's what Vayilech Haran. That sounds like the halach part. The prophet here, Hosea, Vayivrach. Thing I know, right? So he fled. So in the Yaakov of Hosea is somebody who is fleeing to Sedei Aram. It's more that latter Jacob. It's that Jacob, the one who's fled from his home into some form of exile into Sedei Aram, and there Vayavod Yisrael B'isha. There he is an Eved. There he works and toils and undergoes travails. Okay, and let me pause there because maybe you see where I'm going with that, right? But there in Aram, he becomes an Eved. Okay, so that's the Vayivrach, Vayilech part, which Beth alerts us to. Thank you very much. Okay, what else?
Could I make one more comment?
Yes, please do.
And this is apropos in part of what you just said in English about Yaakov being blessed.
Yeah.
Vayivrach and Baruch are homonyms for each other.
Interesting.
Final letter is different, but the pronunciation is the same. So it's kind of an interesting switcheroo.
Yeah.
The situation
even if you have like a more of a guttural chet than I do, nonetheless, it still does sound pretty similar. So that's an interesting thing. Yeah, Sherry.
Oh. Well, also in listening to the review, I mean, I've never felt that Rivka comes off very good, especially in last week's Parsha, because she does nothing but give Jacob terrible advice at every step, and she's false. She said, this is going to be on me, and of course it's not, because that's not how life is. And she said, as you reminded us, she's going to send him word, which she never does. And he just falls off the radar screen, Rivka's radar screen. And here, when he gets to Aram, he came under difficult circumstances, but he thrived and he made his own decisions, and he started making choices for himself without being misled by others, and he prospered, and he had so much at the end, even though it was still very difficult. So in some ways, he went from being just in a lot of danger, but by the end, he really landed on his feet.
That's very interesting. So you read these stories, the Jacob stories, as kind of a process of individuation, right? Of leaving the nest, and when one leaves the nest and they go into the world, so you encounter things firsthand, and the world can be difficult, but he emerges through that crucible. He emerges more matured and emboldened, and certainly independent and such. Interesting.
I haven't.
Yes, go ahead.
So there's two things that I noticed with these two sentences. One is, it's like an abbreviation of a whole evolution. That the line 13, he starts as Yaakov, then he becomes Yisrael, and then in 14, it's the people of Israel. So it's the transformation from Yaakov, who was seriously flawed, to Yisrael after he wrestled with the angel, to the people. And the other observation of the covenantal promise includes inui ve'avdut. And so the first one is vaya'avod, so that's avdut, and inui, well, we know that he suffered at the house of Lavan,
right?
And then that led to the redemption. So those are my two observations.
Remember, in Lavan Garti, he also experienced Gerut there, right? He lived with Lavan.
And Gerut, correct. Yes.
Was a stranger there. Excellent. Okay.
Right.
So let me build off of both of those, if I might. Please feel free to keep on sharing, everybody. There's a in the background of this analogy, which we're already sort of exploiting, if you or trying to glean meaning from, lies the parallelism between the story of Jacob in Aram and the story of Israel in Egypt. And I am, I'm here standing on the shoulders of the greats. So, both Rabbi Silber, Dr. DeVore Steinmetz, and many others have pointed out that the story of Jacob in exile, if you will, could be understood as a prefiguration or a microcosm or something of the sorts of the story of the Jewish people in Egypt. Let me just remind us that the Arami Oved Avi forms the backbone of the Haggadah, of the Passover story, and Arami Oved Avi, could be my father was a wandering Aramean, Aram Naharaim, Abraham, or could also be the story, of course, of Lavan, right? That the Aramean tried to destroy my father, the story of Lavan afflicting Jacob. And the truth is that if you think about the promise here, I'm actually not building off, I'm just citing David Silber, but when you think about the promise to Abraham of the fourth generation, right, that your children will become many, but they will experience affliction and such. Right, as you mentioned before, Avdut and Inoi and Gerut, then the fourth generation will return to the land. So in one reading, the fourth generation are the generation that leaves Egypt. And that's one way of reading, calculating, especially, right, if you started from from Jacob. But if you start from Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, it's Jacob's children who are the ones who are supposed to go return, and they return, of course, amongst great wealth, b'rechush gadol. So in one cycle, you have, in one way of thinking about the fourth generation, going down to exile and returning, you have the Jewish people returning from Egypt, Uva Navi Ha'Allah Adonai et Israel, here Israel meaning the people Israel from Egypt, but it's also the fourth generation are the children of Jacob, the forefather. They are the fourth generation from Abraham, and they are returning from this distant land, right? They'll be in the land which is not their own, a land of travail and trouble and avdut and exile and estrangement, and they will return. So that's just one example. They return, of course, with great numbers and great wealth. So the stories are actually very much in parallel. Maybe you want to say something like Maaseh Avot Siman Labanim, as Nachmanides likes to often say, that the stories of the patriarchs are somehow signifiers of the signified of what will happen to the children. And that's sort of a way, but literally you could also say that they are micro and macrocosms of the same basic motif, going off into exile and returning. And given that, by Rach Yaakov Sedei Aram, right, Jacob has fled to Sedei Aram. By Ya'avod Yisrael Be'isha, you see again the avdut there. He has worked Be'isha for his wife on behalf of, remember the story of Jacob. U'Be'isha Shamar, and for his wife he kept guard. Now I'm reminded of in this verse and the next verse of Navi Nishmar, of the theme of Shmirah by Pesach, right? Lil Shimurimhu, right? It's a night of being watched. There's a sense of Shmirah, of being watched, of keeping watch, of keeping keeping watch, and also a sense of the one keeping watch, demonstrating therefore some sense of fealty and fidelity and loyalty, right? Taking care of the other. So when God, God makes sure that through the prophet, the people of Israel are kept guarded, even after they are redeemed, apparently, right, through Moshe. So why is this all important? Well, in the context of the Haftorah, it seems like the prophet is making, one way of reading this is that the prophet is making a claim that God has taken care of the people, that God has protected the people in Egypt, and in a sense, God was present in the backdrop in the story of Yaakov in Aram, and we should read Pesach onto this week's Parashah Vayetze, and this becomes important for the prophet because as he goes on to say, despite all of this, God's kindness here, Ephraim, meaning Israel, I guess in general, we'd say, has given offense, damavalav, right? Hichis Ephraim tamrurim, has given bitter offense, v'charpato yashiv lo adonav, and he's been requited, right, for that disgrace, for that cherpa, and goes on to speak of Israel's sins. Now, Israel's sins here include this interesting sin of Ya'asu lehem masecha. They had made for themselves molten images, and that reminds the reader mikaspam, from their money, from their silver, I should say. They have created idols. Ma'aseh charushim kula lahem heimomrim. Yet for these they appoint. They say for these they appoint men to sacrifice zochei adam agalim ishakun. Right, they are wont to kiss these calves, so they're worshiping these calves. But Anochi Adonai Elohechem Eretz Mitzrayim, I am the Lord your God who took you out of Egypt, etc. Right. So what this is referencing, probably it seems, is after the redemption from Egypt, the story of the golden calf. And there's 2 points here. One is the asulaham egel masecha, as it says in back in Exodus. They make for themselves these molten images. That's one problem, right? Idolatry. But 2 is mikaspam, that the images are coming from their kesef, from their money. And the prophet here, Navi, will go on to say, I took you out of Egypt and I cared for you and saved you, and yet from your own kesef you have sinned. Once you enter into a state of security, especially or most prominently financial security, all of a sudden you are sinning, right? He says later on, Kamaritam vayispa'u sab'u vayaram libam al kain shechachuni. When they grazed, they were sated. When they were sated, they grew haughty, and so they forgot me. It sounds a lot like Deuteronomy, Devarim, where the Chumash warns against entering into the land. And once one is redeemed from Egypt and enters into the land, one of the major challenges of the land is that you can become secure there and become actually wealthy. And once you are wealthy, you can forget. You can forget where you came from. You can forget God's kindness to you. You could forget God entirely. That expresses itself in idolatry, literally, and expresses itself in a general sense of forgetting God. And that's much of what the Haftorah is about. So, pausing there, even without reading the whole Haftorah yet, we've so far demonstrated the parallelism between verses 13 and 14, where we've sort of taken for granted there's a parallelism, we've noticed the parallelism and tried to be doreshit and understand that in general there's a analogy, there's some sort of relationship between the story of Jacob in Sdei Aram and the story of Israel in Egypt. And in both cases, the fourth generation leaves this land of exile with much rechush, with much wealth. The trick, therefore, the Haftorah warns, is to not forget God once you've already been redeemed, not through idolatry and not through too much security. The idolatry not only of a masecha of molten images, but the masecha which comes from one's kesef, if you will, that comes from one's silver and one's abundance. So there's a warning implicit in this Haftorah, and you could read it actually as a warning back to Jacob and his children, right, as they're going off to Padan Aram, and there eventually he'll acquire great rechush and great wealth. Be careful, right? Be careful what becomes of you once you have received all that security and wealth when you return to the land. Okay, so this is one point I wanted to note. Point number 2 is that when Jacob is working Be'isha, and let me just note that by Avod Yisrael Be'isha, U'Be'isha Shamar, for he had to guard, here they write he had to guard sheep, meaning he has to shepherd for 7 years and then 7 years again for the sake of earning his wife or his wives. There is, by the way, a little pun here because the wife who he means to work for, her name is Rachel, right? Not Leah, right? Her name is Rachel. And Rachel itself means is another word for sheep, right? The Rechelim are the sheep. It's actually already in Bereshit itself. So Uisha Shamar, he is guarding the sheep as a shepherd, but he also, in a sense, is keeping faith with, being loyal to all those many years, being loyal to his spouse, being loyal to his wife. He's being the loyal groom. Shamar at Ishto. So it would be Isha Shamar on behalf of a wife, but also he's also Shomer, so he's sort of being Shomer the Isha at the same time, the Rachel wife, whose name evokes the sheep who require the shepherd. And I stress that because in Hosea in general, there is much play of the metaphor, the motif of the husband-wife relationship. In Tanakh in general, there are a few places where the husband-wife metaphor for the God-Israel relationship is made explicit. In Jeremiah chapter 3, in of course in the Song of Songs, if you read it a certain way, it's maybe implicit already in the book of Numbers, but that's not for now. But in Hosea, it's explicit as well. In Hosea, there is the metaphor of husband and wife for God and Israel is deployed both in the beginning of the book. Take a look there if you're interested in very surprising ways, and also at the here towards the end of the book as well. So when we speak of Jacob keeping faith with his wife and guarding his wife, and then God is taking care of the people Israel. You have the sort of husband-wife marital relational metaphor being employed, and it is encouraging the reader and the people to both understand Jacob's relationship to his wife in a certain way, but also is asking Israel to keep faith with God as a married couple would keep fidelity to one another, right? So the sin of idolatry, which will be mentioned below, as we just read, that is a sin which sometimes is understood as sort of an extramarital affair, basically, right? That it's a betrayal of the spouse, it's a betrayal of that relationship, and to go, after others and leaving behind one's spouse. So I think that also is implicit here. Let's make another point, which this now will scroll back up earlier in the text where the Sephardim start, and really where Jacob really appears explicitly here. Because earlier in the text, early in the chapter, we had Jacob mentioned explicitly. This has to do with, who is this Jacob that we're dealing with in the book of Hosea. So in the course of critiquing Israel, we have as follows. Riv ladonayim Yehuda, this is earlier in verse 3 of chapter 12. V'levkoda Yaakov kidrachav, kima'alalav yashivlo. God has a fight. God has a bone to pick with Judah, and God is paying attention, counting, and wants to give a due reckoning to Jacob. Kidrachav, kima'alalav yashivlo, requite him for his deeds. And while Judah and Jacob may be understood as general terms for the people, it gets really individualistic in a moment. Ba'beten akav et achiv. In the womb, Akav, Yaakov, he grabbed onto the heel of his brother. Ba'beten akav et achiv. Uva'ono sarat Elohim. Grown to manhood, ono meaning in his strength, sarat Elohim. He fought. He struggled with, he strove with an Elohim, with God, with a divine being. It's the Jacob story. It's the Jacob story. Vayasar el malach vayuchal. He strove and struggled with an angel, vayuchal, and prevailed. Sarita em Elohim vatuchal. Bacha vayitchanen lo. It's actually unclear. Chazal talk about this in the Talmud, I believe. Bacha vayitchanen lo, who's crying and who's imploring? But let's read it as the angel maybe was forced to cry and call out and beg for mercy by Tchalin, so he defeats the angel. Beit El yimse'enu v'sham yidaber imanu. At Beit El he found him, right? Ein zekiyim Beit Elohim v'zeh sha'ar shamayim, beginning of Parashah Vayetze. V'sham yidaber imanu, there to speak with him. V'Adonai l'tzavaot, Adonai zichro. So at this point, it's interesting. One way of reading this text is as follows: Jacob has erred. Jacob has this continues from last week. Jacob has sinned. That's one way of reading this. Jacob, the figure in Genesis, and and he needs to be requited for his deeds. How so? One, babeten akavat achiv. He tried to supplant his brother already in the beten, in the womb, and he tries to strive with this divine being. Maybe there's a parallel there. Remember the midrashim that the divine being with whom he's striving, who he meets when he's alone, Vayavek Ishimo Adalot HaShachar is none other than the angel of Esav, right? That there's a parallel there between his story of with Esav in the womb and the story of his striving with this great mighty figure when he is left alone at night. And maybe here there's a critique actually of that story. It's more common, I think, nowadays to hear a critique of Jacob and his dealings with the birthright and Esav than to think that maybe there's something challenging about his striving with the Elohim, with this mysterious being. But potentially that's what the Hosea might be alluding to. There's something, God is Riv Ladonai, Lefkoda Yaakov. There's something about that is not so appropriate ultimately. And therefore, that's what leads to the call of Tabalohecha Tashuv. Come back, and you need to do tashuv, chesed and mishpat shemor, right? You have to return to chesed and mishpat. Another piece of evidence that there is something problematic, and this is a reference to the Jacob story, and not just a reference to the Jacob story, but actually a critique of Jacob here, is as you continue reading, we see God says you have to return. Kina'an biado ba'oznei mirma la'ashok ahev. A traitor who uses false balances, they translate here, who loves to overreach, right? You become this person, you Ephraim, you Israel. You practice, falsity and cheating. Ba'oznei mirma. That term, mirma, evokes the use of that term also in the Jacob story, because when Jacob gets the birthright from Esav, and then he dresses like Esav, etc. So Esav finds out, and Esav says, "Bless me also, my father." And Jacob says to him, Isaac says to Esav, "Vayomer ba'achicha b'mirma." Your brother has come here b'mirma. Your brother has come here deceitfully and taken your birthright. So the one who is guilty of acting b'mirma is actually none other than our protagonist Jacob. One moment. Yes. So it's none other than Jacob. So here, when we have the figure who is referenced as being guilty of mirma, it may be a reference to Jacob as well, and continuing that critique. And in that sense, the prophet is contrasting Jacob and perhaps the ideal figure how we should act, but also God who acts with such chesed, and God who is keeping fealty, and as it says in the beginning of Hosea, has embraced us bechesed v'rachamim. So tzedek v'mishpat bechesed v'rachamim. So God here critiques Jacob, critiques Ephraim, critiques the people Israel for not acting quite the same way, right? Neither their forefather and nor they now in their, the people themselves. After all, Hichis Ephraim Tamrurim. Ephraim has given bitter offense, but Tamrurim, where I'm scrolling here, that sounds a lot like mirma. It evokes the term mirma, right? They too have acted b'mirma. They're continuing in this path. And Yosifu Lachato, and they are continuing the path. They are continuing the path of Jacob and his sinfulness, and they're continuing in this reading, and they're continuing after the people leaving Egypt in their creation of the golden calf. These stories are being replayed, and God has said, "I have taken care of you all these years. I have stayed close with you and stayed loyal to you, and yet you have not repaid me and stayed loyal in turn. You must return. Eventually, therefore they say, Shuva Yisrael Hashem Elokecha, therefore return Israel, Tichu Machem Divarim V'Shuvu, come back, take with you words with you and return to God, confess, own up, acknowledge, and at that point you'll be taken back. Ohavim erpem ushuatam ohavim nedava kishava pimimenu. You'll be forgiven and taken back entirely. You'll abandon your idols and return. And the prophecy ends with this really interesting line: Mi chacham v'yavein ela navon v'yedaim. Who is wise who will really understand the following? At least that's why I'm reading it. That the wisdom, the wise will consider the following words, as opposed to the aforementioned, the following words. Yesharim darchei Adonai, because the path of God is Yesharim, right, if you will. Yisrael, Yeshurun, Yashar, not Akav, straight. Yesharim darchei Hashem. And Tzadikim Yelchuvam, the righteous can walk on them, the righteous should walk on them, on these paths of God, they are straight. Ufoshim yikashluvam, but sinners stumble on them. This is a very celebrated line because it seems to be a curious turn of phrase here, curious imagery. You have a straight path, a straight derech of God, and which the righteous can walk. The righteous should walk because, after all, there's no stumbling blocks there. And yet, the verse concludes, Poshim, sinners stumble on the very same path. And what it's bespeaking, you could argue, and I'll try to demonstrate this in a moment, what it's bespeaking or evoking is just how narrow the path of Sikut really is. There are times where it seems like it's very clear, and the paths of righteousness and the path of Poshim are different, distant from each other, and the only, the rub is, at that fork in the road where one is straight and one is not. The rub is really, the challenge is choosing, the path which to be straight and right. But once you choose that path, it's smooth sailing, it's smooth walking. There's nowhere to stumble. And that is true sometimes in life, right? The difficulty lies at the fork in the road, but once you make the choice is clear, the paths are distinct, and once you're on it, you're good to go. But perhaps more often, I don't know about your experience, but perhaps more often, it's not so clear, and the paths are more similar. And actually, the very same path, the very same road can be either smooth or full of stumbling blocks. The very same path, dependent upon who you are walking on it, and maybe perhaps the micro decisions you make along the way. When the Talmud speaks, and here I'm citing for you, I'm showing you one passage from the Talmud in Masechet Nazir. When the Talmud cites this verse, it says as follows: Amar Rabbi Bar Chana, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Bar Chana said in the name of the sage Rabbi Yochanan, what does this mean? Yesharim darchei Hashem, v'tzadikim yelchuvam, u'poshlim yikashlubam. What could that mean? How can the same path lead to such different outcomes? How could it be that the same path is both straight and smooth and also full of stumbling blocks and obstacles? So there's a bunch of, there's actually a debate here, right, as to what that might mean. I'll give you a couple of examples. Rabbi Yochanan said, well, I'll tell you what it's like. This is like two people, mashal, Livshnei b'nei Adam. It's like two people, both of whom offer a Karban Pesach. They both offer a Paschal sacrifice. They both do the same mitzvah. However, one eats it. We talked about intention earlier at the beginning with the upcoming seminar. One eats it l'shum mitzvah, l'shem mitzvah. One eats it because it's a mitzvah, and the other eats it because he's hungry. The echad ochlo l'shum achila gasa. One eats it because he wants to eat, you're not supposed to leave any of it over, right? So one eats the whole thing because it's a mitzvah. One eats it because he's hungry. He's gorging himself. So the one who eats it for the sake of the mitzvah, he is doing it qua, and the righteous shall walk in this path. and it's straight and it's no stumbling block for them, and they're on the derech Hashem. But someone who eats all of this stuff because they're stuffing themselves, that's someone who's a poshim yikashlubam. Now this line is debated. If you take a look at Nazir 23a, you'll see Reish Lakish doesn't like that line, right? He says, how are you going to call this guy, on the path of call this guy Russia, call him a posheya? After all, he's doing a mitzvah. At the end of the day, you're going to say that guy's a Russia. So he has a different understanding of that verse, and it's very interesting, and you should read that whole passage. But I cite this for you just as an example, one Talmudic reading of this verse, to share with you this way of understanding many of life's decisions, many of the paths in life, where it's unclear which path, if you will, is that of the tzaddik, which passes out of the rasha. Or say it differently, the very same path, the very same decision, depending on who you are in doing it, perhaps why you're doing it, perhaps what else, contingencies around that decision can make it either God's highway or, the road paved to hell, with whatever intentions you have. That's actually, it's a bit of a sobering line and sobering prophecy, and way of entering a Haftorah. But I think it's an important one and resonant with real life. And going back to the theme of I'm going to stop the screen share here so I can see you. And going back to Aviva, I just saw your chat from a long time ago. I'm sorry, when I'm screen sharing, I couldn't see it, but I'll stay on after for a minute or two if you want to talk. But not only is it resonant with life, but also is resonant with the Haftorah, because you could read the Jacob story in at least two ways: one of Sadikim Yelchubam, or one of Poshim, Yikashlubam. I don't mean to call our forefather Posheh, God forbid, but I think there's definitely a reading which we've been, exercising here. In which Jacob is not fully in the right and has to learn those lessons and receives recompense for his earlier deceits. That's certainly one way of reading. There's one way of reading the Jacob path. Another way of reading the Jacob path is that here is a righteous person, engaging with the difficult world, and ultimately, God is with him, and he emerges victorious and returns to the land with Rechush Gadol, and God has been with him. Sarita Elohim Batuchal, and indeed he earned the name Israel. So there's two ways of reading it, and I think those two ways of reading it are important textually, and they're also important in thinking about life, right? And the Parashah and the Haftorah put together really, I think, are very provocative and challenging in thinking about the stories and thinking about our own choices in life, with the very same decisions sometimes, depending on who we are and what we bring of ourselves to that decision, can either be derech Hashem or not. Can either be Yesharim, Yisrael path, or not. Right? It's not always easy to tell, but the Torah is not here to tell us easy things either. So just to try to ennoble us and try to enlighten us, and that requires sometimes harder truths than easier truths. Okay, so with that, I wish us all luck on our respective paths, and I'm going to hang on here for another couple minutes because I see some people might have had comments, and I would like to hear them. Okay, so thanks everybody, and see you next week. Yeah, so Sherry and Ramel, so I'm here to talk up. Yeah.
Well, I'm struck in the last couple of weeks to realize how the selection of particular Haftarah we sort of take for granted. This Haftarah, if you're a Sephardi, in the Sephardi, one of the two, this is the Ashkenazi. But when you consider the range of that they could have chosen from, that these particular, even if I was looking at Hosea, even if the Haftorah had started at the beginning of chapter 11, it would have been a totally different feeling of it, much less the whole range of prophetic literature that could have been matched with this. And as you've been pointing out so evocatively and so incredibly, that the choice of the Haftorah really becomes a narrative that we read it together in this dialogue, which is extraordinarily rich and suggestive to me in the last couple of weeks. But there could have been a whole, millions of different other possibilities of pairing, taking 21 verses from somewhere else, from anything else, and opening up a dialogue with the Parashah. It's kind of mind-boggling.
Absolutely, and the truth is, we could have this series go for years, each year, focusing on different traditions readings, right? Or
yeah,
it's harder to do in our slot, to do each week all the different traditions. That just get too unwieldy. But you see how rich it could get. Absolutely, I appreciate that. And I wanted to say also that something that's really interesting. I just pulled it. I'm looking for this. I had this listing here of here it is, of the Haftorah. What's interesting in the way the Ashkenazim do it, goes to what you just said, Sherry, is that the Ashkenazim, we read from, Hosea chapter 12, we started today, right? Chapter 12 and on for this week. And then they go backwards and they go back to Hosea chapter 11 for next week. It doesn't, the Sephardim, it's a little cleaner for the Sephardim because they read Hosea 11 to 12, this week, and then they read something else next week. So, but it's actually, I just sort of put that out there. I don't have an answer yet. Maybe by next week I will, maybe next week I won't, which is like, what do we make of the Ashkenazic practice, or what's become the standard Ashkenazic practice of reading Hosea backwards, right? Reading Hosea backwards. Okay, Viva, thank you. I see what you're writing here now. In the chat. I'll also say, by the way, that it's kind of cool and intriguing to, because it's interesting to start the Haftorah where we did, right? That with Jacob fleeing towards Aram, which I get because it's Parashah Vayetze, but it also means that you have excised this week. You've excised the portion where it implies at least that Jacob has done something wrong, right? That you only hear of next week. So it's complicated, Rumel, what did you want to?
No, I just, I really never paid that much attention to the Haftorah, but now, I see, I'm glad I'm taking the course because I see the parallels and how they go back and, put emphasis on things that happen in the Parashah of the week. So it is important to read that and then see the parallels to the story.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, terrific. I'm glad you're here also, and I'm glad I'm teaching it because it makes me appreciate it more also. And let me just highlight two things about that. Is that two things that you said, right? One is the emphasis. So one thing Haftorah end up doing is emphasizing certain features over others. Okay, so when you read a parsha, you read anything, you sort of ask yourself, what here is core and what is ancillary and what's tertiary. So willy-nilly, if you have a Haftorah which picks one piece and makes that puts that center, so it's sort of a claim of this is really important in the parsha, right? It's a little more complicated than I just made it out to be because there are different ways of dividing the parashiyot, and there's a whole triennial history and custom of reading, and land of Israel and otherwise it's a whole thing, and at times it seems that this, Fishbein has argued, I trust him on this, that at times it seems that the annual cycle Haftorah has picked up on and preserved a triennial cycle reading. So, for example, maybe you say you have 10 chapters in this reading, this annual reading, and you pick chapter 5 to focus on a Near Haftorah, but maybe that Haftorah was birthed out of a historical circumstance in which a triennial circumstance in which 1 year only chapter 15 was read, right, or only 15 and 16 or something along those lines, or 15 at least started a reading, if that made sense. But even if that's true historically, the effect is the same. It's kind of the same. The effect is that you end up emphasizing a particular passage. The other thing I want to say, just to highlight, but what Ramel said, and then I'll stop, I think, because of time, is that when Ramel said the thing about reading backwards. So that's very important methodologically, because I think we have a bias, most people have a bias towards reading forwards, right? Like you take the Haftorah and you see how that like goes, you take the Parashah and you see how that reads into the Haftorah, right? And how that like goes, bye Beth, okay, have a good day. But at the same time, once you've created the relationship, you're encouraged to read the Haftorah into the Parashah. That makes you reread the Parashah. Not only read the Haftorah different, right? Makes you read the Haftorah, and that I think is partly what we've been trying to do here on a methodological level. Okay, got to stop here. Noah, you want to close us off?
Sure. So thank you, as always, Dr. Kelsen, and everyone participating here for creating a rich morning or afternoon, depending where you are, of learning. Have a wonderful, wonderful day, and be well, and
Everybody.
happy learning.
Thank you, Noah. Thank you for everything you do. Take care, everybody.